Gary, if you could start by introducing yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Gary Fielder. I'm an attorney from Denver, Colorado.
What is O'Rourke versus Dominion class action?
Well, first of all, it was a brainchild. A little bit after the election, I was watching the cases that were coming down from Sidney Powell and Linwood and Rudy Giuliani and others, and just wondering, what was the real approach to take and what was the best thing for the people, really. And so, a little bit after Thanksgiving, it really struck me that instead of trying to stop the election, instead of trying to get an injunction or to ask a federal court to tell a state what to do, the best way to approach the situation was through a damages claim, through a class action lawsuit. So I started talking to some friends of mine, attorneys and other people that I knew, and pretty soon we had some people interested in becoming plaintiffs, and before you knew it we had 8 different people from 6 different states that were interested in becoming the original plaintiffs of what hopefully will become a massive class action lawsuit. And it kind of speaks for itself. It's a class action lawsuit that attempts to demonstrate that there were many actors in this situation, negligent, reckless, intentional, or otherwise, that violated the rights of the voters in the United States. And so when you talk about class members or who's in the class, well, if you're a registered voter, no matter who you got, no matter who you voted for, your rights were violated. Your vote didn't count as much as it should have. If it got digitized, if it got changed, if it got switched. If you voted for Biden, maybe you're happy that he won the election. If you voted for Trump, you're all upset. But that's not the point. The point is, what about the next election? What about the election after that? Who's going to gain control of this technology? Is having voting machines, just generally speaking, a good idea? Much less the other individuals like the governors and secretary of states who really breach their constitutional duty, not to mention some of the other defendants, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg and others, who not only interacted individually and through their companies directly with regard to the election, but then took steps to suppress the speech of others who attempted to complain about it. So yeah, it's a complaint for damages, but there'll ultimately be a request for injunctive relief. There'll ultimately be some changes and just the public disclosure of information, not what you hear on the internet, not what you read in an article, but what can be proven to a jury. Not a judge, but what can be proven to a jury is going to make all the difference. That's what's going to be the difference maker in this case, as opposed to others that may have gotten dismissed or didn't gain any traction.
You mentioned some of the defendants. Could you list them all?
Well, we've got a list right here. Dominion Voting Systems is the first defendant, Facebook Inc., a nonprofit from Illinois called the Center for Tech and Civic Life. That's an outfit that interacted with several states and essentially dumped monies and chosen voter precincts with the help of donations from Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan. But both of them are defendants. And Governor Kemp, not in his official capacity, so it's really Brian Kemp, Brad Raffensperger, you could say, Secretary of State from Georgia, Raffensperger, but we're not suing the Secretary of State, we're suing Mr. Raffensperger in his individual capacity. Gretchen Whitmire, with all due respect, Governor Whitmire, but we're not suing her as Governor Whitmire. She's an individual. She's no more important than me or you or anybody else. And if she violates the Constitution, she must be held accountable to that. Her Secretary of State, Jacqueline Benson, Tom Wolf, and Catherine Buckvar, Tony Evers, Ann Jacobs, and the other individuals from the Wisconsin Election Commission, WEC, Mark Thompson, Marge Bostelman, Julie Glancy, Den Knudsen, Dean Knudsen, Robert Spendle, and maybe most importantly, Does 1 through 10,000, who aren't named as of yet, but could and will be added as defendants as the litigation progresses and as the discovery ensues.
Who's eligible to be a plaintiff?
Well, really anybody that's a registered voter, and that's a lot of people. That could be 150 to 160 million people. But that's not everybody in the world, and that's not every American. That's people that have committed their time to register. Whether they voted or not, I think is irrelevant. It might be relevant, but I think it's irrelevant. So it's every voter in America. I mean, we're all vested. It's the voter rolls that we send out the jury summons. So you're really talking about the individuals in the country who have taken the time to get a driver's license, not have a felony, register to vote, active in the system, participate in the jury process. So although it's a lot of people, it's the vested citizens, so to speak. Because if you're not registered to vote or you don't want to vote, well then who cares? You haven't really opted in. And it may sound strange, but voting is not an inalienable right. That's not a God-given right. That's a right, maybe,
Privilege.
not guaranteed, but maybe given to the people of a country. Not every country gives their people the right to vote, but yeah, it's a privilege. And so in that regard, if you were given that privilege to vote and you voted, but your vote was diminished, and not even that, even if your vote counted in a state that didn't have any of this nefarious behavior, but individuals and entities such as Dominion or Facebook or these individual natural persons impacted the presidential election. See, that's what this is all about. Not necessarily about Biden or Trump, but everybody has a right to vote for the president. And so, even though a person from Colorado can't vote for a U.S. senator from Georgia, maybe that person from Colorado has no standing to object to how senators are elected in Georgia. If Georgia or Michigan or Pennsylvania or any other state is violating the Constitution with regard to the election of the president, and we're all voting for the president, interested in seeing who that person is and who's going to be the civilian arm of the military, well then, that's the whole point. If some people are using the system in an illegal or unconstitutional manner in one state, they're still affecting everybody else across the country who also has an interest in the choice of who the president's going to be, and the vice president as well. But that's why we think that each individual voter across the country has standing to object to the behavior, not of other states, but of other individuals that live in other states for the activity that they engaged in with regard to the presidential election.
Why did this class action need to be filed?
Well, I did wait a little bit. I mean, I was hoping that some of the other cases would get traction, and quite frankly, I was hoping that someone would file a class action lawsuit so that I didn't have to. But noting that nobody was getting any traction, and that all these other lawyers were suing these government individuals in their official capacity, it was pretty clear that somebody had to do something. Somebody with a law license and an ability to file a federal lawsuit had to do something. And to date, here it is, early February, no one's filed a class action lawsuit. I've heard a lot of talk about it, but as far as I know, we're the only class action lawsuit that's been filed across the country with regard to these actors that everyone's talking about. So it had to be filed. And somebody had to do it. So it didn't have to be me, but that's what it's come down to. Myself and co-counsel Ernie Walker.
Speaking of, why are you, Gary Fielder, and Ernie Walker the correct attorneys for this job?
Well, first of all, we love America, we love the Constitution, and we're not bound by a big firm or this grandiose reputation that lawyers have, or concern for what others think, and for that matter, concern for our lives and for our freedom. Although we are concerned for those issues, if we don't straighten this mess out, if we can't have a system in 2020 where one person votes and that one little vote is recorded correctly and counted correctly, well, then we don't even have a country. I mean, every issue comes down to the people's ability to vote for their representatives. So, it had to be someone like us. It had to be someone who was willing to not throw caution to the wind. This isn't a Hail Mary. But on the other hand, willing to put it all on the line, and willing to put our reputations on the line and our lives on the line. And we don't want our family hurt, and we don't want to be hurt. But we're not just going to bow down and just let all this happen without some sort of attempt to redress the situation. And so Ernie's got a lot of experience. I've been practicing law for 30 years. I've been in federal court, filed many civil actions, constitutional complaints, civil rights actions. So we're not the perfect people for the job, and we need help. I mean, we need other lawyers. We need a big firm to help us out. But in order to get this rocket off the launch pad, someone had to create enough energy to get it going and get it moving into space. And it seems to be like we're the only ones that raised our hand for the duty.
Why is this that moment in history?
Well, it is strange to think about whether the election had gone the other way, and whether any of these issues really would have been dealt with without what happened. And I'm not here to support one candidate over the other. That's not our call. But you can't ignore the information that's coming out. You just can't ignore allegations that have been outlined in under oath affidavits that, for example, these voting machines count votes on a percentage basis. And so there's evidence that 200 ballots were run through some of these instruments, and 100 for one candidate and 100 for the other candidate. Except the count came out 87 for one candidate and 113 for another. And they couldn't believe it. This was in Georgia. So they ran the 200 through again. 100 for one candidate, 100 for another candidate. No. Again, 87 for one, 113 for another. So that means that an algorithm was set. There was information that the votes that were the ballots that were introduced to the machines were the information was sent out of the country and then adjudicated and then sent back into the country. Well, what is that all about? None of us thought that these voting machines could even be connected to the internet. So now that we know that they were, and that's beyond any doubt, well, we've got to take care of this situation. So let's just say, for example, without picking sides, that the incumbent President Trump had won the election. Well, maybe we wouldn't even be talking about this. Maybe we wouldn't be dealing with it. Maybe it wouldn't have come to the fore. And frankly, maybe it was a wiser decision to just let this presidential election be accurately counted. But that wasn't what happened. So this is the time in history, and I don't think it's predestined. I'm not sure there's prophecy involved. All I know is everyone feels it. Everyone knows exactly what we're talking about. Everyone feels this sense of emptiness or fear. And, if your candidate won, you're all happy about it. But I even think that many people who are happy about the Biden victory must have some suspicions. And if they don't, they're suppressing him. And even if they don't, the whole point is, what's the truth? What are the real facts? What are we going to find? This isn't a fishing expedition. We have a foundation of facts that we're going to build from. But in the end, if it's established that a voting machine can't just simply accurately count the votes, then where are we? Now I understand that some ballots have to be so-called adjudicated, I understand that. And that somebody has to take a look at the intent of the voter, whether or not a box was filled in completely or whether it was circled or whatever the case may be. But the error rates that are coming out of some of these precincts that are doing just basic audits, error rates over 50% when they really should be maybe 1 in a couple of thousand, maybe 1 in a couple of 100,000. But the error rate's 50% or higher, and that all of those ballots, 50% or higher, are all being adjudicated, maybe in a foreign country. Well, that ought to concern everybody. That just ought to concern everybody. And so that's really what this is all about. It's an allegation based upon a foundation of facts, but one that has to be further researched, and information needs to be discovered and shared and analyzed, and the truth needs to surface as to exactly what's happening here. It seems so simple, you could just count a vote and add it up, even with the adjudications, but that's just not what took place.
What is the timeline for the case?
Well, we filed the complaint on December 22nd, so in that sense, we served some of the defendants. Some of the defendants have not been served. However, we're in the process now of preparing for what will eventually be motions to dismiss, motions for sanctions, attorney's fees, disbarment, and everything else that they're going to throw in there. I understand that the defendants involved are going to object and assert that this is frivolous, or that these issues have already been determined, and that all the cases have been dismissed, but I'm not aware that a jury has been picked. I'm not aware that any of these issues have really been resolved. And so at this point, we're in the early stages of the case, and so we never tried to stop the election. We never tried to get a state to do one thing or the other. So if we get by these motions to dismiss, and the defendants are required to file an answer, and the at issue, we call it the at issue date, comes, then discovery could take a year or more. Depositions, interrogatories, requests for production of documents, it could go on. Cases could get joined. Dominion Voting Systems is actively suing people for billions of dollars. Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, and Fox News, and other commentators. So they're going on the offense. And so maybe some of these cases will be joined, maybe we'll be on our own, but if it actually went to a jury trial, which I suspect that it will, that could take 2 years. So frankly, we're in the early stages. Now if we get dismissed out, there'll be an appeal. And that appeal will be the 10th Circuit. That could take a year or two. But that's called litigation. That's not unusual. In any case, that's not unusual in any case. So we're just getting off the ground. And we could have filed this a month from now. We could have filed this too. I didn't need to file it in December. But I felt like it needed to get out there. It needed to be filed. We needed to get the process rolling as opposed to waiting to see what was happening. So I waited long enough. And so on December 22nd, we filed the case. It's now been 6 weeks later, and we're barely off the mark. But that's how these cases go.
What should supporters and plaintiffs, a part of the class action, expect in the next coming weeks?
Not much, quite frankly, other than what I say, these motions to dismiss. I mean, I know Dominion Voting Systems is going to be filing a motion to dismiss. I'm sure Facebook will be filing a motion to dismiss. And that's relatively common. I mean, it's probably par for the course in federal court. You file a motion to dismiss. It's part of the procedure. Now, just as sure that these entities are going to be threatening Rule 11, which is really a prohibition against filing frivolous lawsuits. This is not a frivolous lawsuit. I know what a frivolous lawsuit looks like, and you can imagine what a frivolous lawsuit looks like. It's typically a pro se plaintiff. We always joke that sometimes a pro se plaintiff will put a lien on an IRS agent's house or something like that. Well, that could be considered frivolous. You see a lot of medical malpractice claims where you can't get a doctor to testify for the plaintiff, even though the plaintiff might think that he or she is really hurt. by this other professional, well, if you can't get an expert to agree with you, that could be considered frivolous. So I know what a frivolous lawsuit looks like, and this is just not one of them. Plus, it's very common for complaints to be amended, and we anticipate filing an amended complaint. The plaintiffs can look forward to that in the next couple of weeks, that's for sure.
How much are the damages and what do they represent?
Well, in a 1983 action, if a constitutional right violation is determined, well, then the law is very clear that it has to at least be $1. And that sounds a little ridiculous, but the law encourages these types of suits to specifically prohibit the behavior in the case and to send a message to others. So, in this regard, the attorney that's forwarding a case can be an attorney general from a state, but if it's a private attorney such as myself and Mr. Walker, we're called private attorney generals. And so attorney's fees could be awarded upon a successful prosecution of the case. We don't think that the damage is $1. We think that the damage to each voter is significant. Even back in December, when there was some talk of the 12th Amendment or the Supreme Court becoming involved, all that went away. All that just didn't materialize. So we really are just talking about damages to the voter. And so if there's 160 million registered voters and the damage is $100 per registered voter, well, that could be $11.6 billion. In our complaint, we used the rate of $1,000 per registered voter. That's $160 billion. So the cover sheet indicates a request for $160 billion, which would be $1,000 for each registered voter in the country. Now, as things have progressed and the country is a breath away from civil war, all based upon an election that, right or wrong, no one has any faith in, or at least a substantial portion of the population doesn't have any faith in, we're beginning to wonder whether or not that's a gross underestimate of how each registered voter has actually been damaged. Maybe it's more than $1,000 per registered voter. That's up to the jury. That's up to the jury. Not the judge. The judge could dismiss the case. But once we get into requiring the defendants to answer and discovery and setting the matter for trial, that's a jury question. As it is in every case. As it is in every case.
How can someone join the class?
Well, we're still working on that because the case is still in its infancy stage. So if we file an amended complaint, we could simply add parties. We could add defendants, which we will, and add plaintiffs, which we will. It's basically starting afresh. However, once we get the amended complaint filed, then we'll try to certify the class. Now, once we certify the class, that might be familiar with, or might be akin to something you're familiar with in terms of seeing a commercial on TV about someone that's been hurt by a particular medical device or something like that. You put the country on notice. One of the things we joke about is, at least with regard to registered voters, we know their names and addresses, and that's a good start. Ironically, part of this lawsuit could be to clean up the voter rolls, because in order to get notice of your right to join this lawsuit, you need to be alive. And so we know that a lot of registered voters aren't alive. So maybe as a part of this lawsuit, we could help clean up the voter rolls. But giving everybody notice of their right to join a class action, well, all of us have gotten that card about a class action lawsuit against your credit card company or something, and then you could just fill out the card and mail it in, and then maybe a year later you'd get a check for 25 cents or something like that. So that's what we're talking about, but that's only after the class has been certified, and that's a legal situation that's going to take some time to develop. So at this point, we've got a website, dominionclassaction.com, You can inquire. You can work with us in terms of joining the lawsuit as just a regular plaintiff. It could be a mass joiner. It doesn't have to be a class action. I mean, 1 million people could join if they wanted to. You can join any lawsuit. And if you're a plaintiff, you could bring your own attorney, join the lawsuit. So these are all decisions that we have to make. Now, we're not going to be spending a ton of time trying to expand a plaintiff base if the case is going to get dismissed. I don't mean to be negative about it, but somebody files a motion to dismiss and they're passionate about it, and of course Dominion will be very passionate about it. Again, they'll call me frivolous and everything else. So you have to at least open up the possibility that it's could be dismissed, and if that happens, we'll be in the appellate court, but we'll have to slow down on signing up plaintiffs or taking their information and things like that. But if we get beyond the motion to dismiss, well, then we'll be crossing a lot more bridges in that regard about who can join and how expansive this thing is going to be. But ultimately, it seems to me that no matter what your political persuasion is, no matter how you feel one way or the other, to the point of, in today's world, being called an extremist, well, if you're registered to vote, you're registered to vote. So it doesn't really matter how you feel or who you are or what you posted or what your neighbors think about you. You're registered to vote. And no matter who you are, if you're registered to vote and you make minimum wage, your vote is worth one. And if you're a billionaire and you're registered to vote, your vote is worth one. And that's it. So we're all equal in that regard. So everyone who's registered to vote, hopefully, will qualify for membership in the class. That's our goal.
How can somebody help with the cost of litigation?
Well, one of the disadvantages that small attorneys have when you take on things like this is trying to afford the cost. And the plaintiffs that we have are not well off or rich by any means. So we'll be, of course, attempting to raise some money to get the experts that we need retained to be able to prosecute this litigation. Now, we have other costs in terms of paralegal fees and just costs generally. Those might be covered by contributions made by the plaintiffs themselves, but certainly with regard to the cost of experts and other monies that we need, we're going to be trying to get people, even who aren't a part of the class, or doesn't really matter who you are. Now we could talk about anybody in the world to contribute. It's not tax deductible, but if you want to help out the cause and try to help us out in terms of getting this thing again off the launch pad, then $10, $1, $100, $100,000, however much somebody can contribute, will be used for those purposes. Not to go on vacations or eat lunches, but to hire experts and to pay for the real costs that are right now coming out of my pocket.